Everybody, welcome back to But Why the podcast where we talk about everything in pop culture and why it matters. And today we have a amazing interview. But first, I'm Kate, and I am here with three guests, the first of which are hosts of other podcasts, Ash from the Safari Zone and Skyhoppers.
Hello.
And Lizzie from the Pilots and Petards podcast.
Hello.
And our grand special guest, Jeremy Whitley, writer of The Unstoppable Wasp.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming to our humble podcast with all of our comic fans here in attendance.
Happy to do it.
So first off, a little bit about us. We talk about things in pop culture that matter, and with the recent publishing of the last Wasp issue, one of the big things around it was watching a great depiction of mental health in comic books. And I know that this is a heavy question to start with, but it's something that I have had on my mind since I read the issue. What inspired you to tackle that type of storyline?
So it was something we talked about from the beginning with the series, because as some people will know, we had a first shot at an Unstoppable Wasp series that only lasted 8 issues. That never quite got around to some of the stuff that we wanted to tackle. But it was something that my editor, Alana Smith, and I had discussed from the beginning, because there is sort of that issue in Nadia's past that, you know, her father, Hank Pym, is pretty heavily associated with mental illness as far as it goes in the Marvel universe. And, you know, it started out as sort of a multiple personality thing, and then, you know, it has recently been sort of fixed to being bipolar. And that was something that, you know, we looked at as we were getting ready, because, you know, bipolar is something that is hereditary, that, you know, you have a much higher chance of getting it if somebody in your family has it. And so we wanted to, you know, think about that and how we could have, you know, Nadia as sort of a positive character that she is, as a much different representation from what we usually see for, you know, mental health in comics, not just from Hank, but, you know, more generally, in that I think for so much of comics history, people with any sort of mental illness, you know, have been villains. I mean, you know, there's a guy that dresses like a bat that has a whole asylum full of them. Can't remember that guy's name, but you know, it's one of those sort of common tropes of comics. You know, people with mental health become some sort of crazy supervillain. You know, I think we've gone a long way to changing what superheroes look like in comics. You know, from a standpoint of gender and race, and you know, representations of gender and sexuality and things like that. But I think mental health is one of those things that's still lagged pretty far behind in, you know, how we look at it in comics and how we represent, you know, what heroic people look like as far as mental health. Because I feel like even when it is something that we address as in heroic characters, it's like a twist, it's a gimmick, it's a, you know, what if they were a superhero but also crazy.
Yeah, that's really great to hear. And I mean, it's something that from the response on Twitter and myself reading it, it was the way you all tackled it was very real. She's shrunken down in her tiny lab, in her pendant, and yet with this fantastical element around her, it is a very real conversation and a very real and empathetic moment. When it comes to writing and showing this type of vulnerability and, you know, even strength with her in this representation, how do you balance? Because I know you also mentioned how happy she is, how optimistic she is, right? How do you balance her having to make hard choices or having to deal with elements like this? What's that process like for you?
I think so much of that was already sort of baked into Nadia, you know, the grittiness, the potential sadness, because, you know, right there in her story, she's, she's never met either of her parents. She's born and then raised in the Red Room. She knows very little about her past. She doesn't even know, their father is Hank Pym until she's a little older. And she's sort of lived all this hardness already. So the biggest thing for me was being able to bring more hope and more excitement to that. That was the thing I wanted to see from Nadia, is for her to be a character who has endured extensive trauma, who has had a really rough go of things, has had a rough life, but makes this decision that she's free now, and she's going to go out there and do her best, and make up for all this lost time. And I think the writing about the mental illness side of things came kind of came not necessarily easy, but simply to me in that regard, in that this is a character who has been very sort of fenced in, has not had a lot of the experiences that other people have. So she's sort of trying to do so much stuff at once that she unintentionally sort of overwhelms herself, and ends up coming sort of headlong into this realization that not everything that she has to deal with are things that she can escape from. That this is a real thing, and it's a real part of her biology, and it's not something that's an evil plot. Because like she says in issue 5, like, superhero stuff is easy. It's easy to be like, okay, well, if I die, I died saving the world. Like, that's not a loss to that person. If you went out saving the world, it wouldn't be great. You'd rather survive, I assume. But at the same time, you get to be heroic. But to have to deal and struggle with real problems, with real illness, is a much more human, but at the same time, much more heroic struggle.
Well, I know that when I was reading it, it was definitely, there was a particular moment that really hit me. And it was when Nadia calls her brain broken. And that is a word that I have actively worked to eliminate from my vocabulary, because as someone who deals with a few chronic illnesses, I have kind of moved past calling myself broken, because so that moment I think was really important, especially when, her friend says, you're not broken. This is as much part of you as the smartest part of your brain, as, the beautiful human being you are. And I think that's so important for every reader. And I think that's not only important for readers who it hits like it hits me, but I think it's also important for readers who maybe have never have felt that before, but who know people who have felt that, just so they can maybe empathize with that and kind of see it a little bit better. So thank you for that.
I know when I read it, it was like what you mentioned earlier, mental health in comics, the way it's portrayed has not always been entirely positive. There's been some positive depictions of it. But seeing that portrayed so honestly on the page was something that was really powerful for me personally, as somebody who struggles with mental illness, because I know as a kid, I looked to comics as kind of my guide as how to navigate the world in a lot of cases. I learned a lot about empathy from the X-Men and stuff like that. So just to see that presented in a way where I could give this to a kid who maybe doesn't understand it, or even an adult who maybe doesn't understand it, and have it explained and portrayed so honestly, was really incredible.
Thank you. Yeah, and that was something I struggled with a little bit writing the book, because I think there's a tendency to want for your heroes to have all the answers, and for you to want them to walk out of things and say like, okay, well, I beat that. For them to not say things like that their brain is broken, which is a thing that if I feel like if I had left it at that would have been like a very problematic bit in there. But like to have them look at it and see like to experience this and to have this thing that in this case they can't overcome. And I think in this case I had to kind of come to the terms that the victory in this case is not Nadia beating bipolar disorder, but Nadia realizing that she can't do it alone and that she has to ask for help, which is in itself a very like difficult and heroic act when especially when you're somebody who's used to being able to depend on themselves for everything.
Yeah, and kind of just reiterate what the other woman said. I definitely, as somebody who has definitely told people to leave me alone and let me do my work when I was not in a healthy state, is something that kind of leaped off the page and was like, oh, I know this moment. This is very real. And that's something that I think goes not only to the single issues, but also to the first and second volumes when she's starting out and bringing together these group of teenagers and young women with her. How do you go about making sure that her voice, her dialogue, the dialogue of others really feels genuine and authentic? Because that is something that I loved while reading. I never once felt like something that was said was didn't belong, or like everything matched. Even the small uses of Spanish with the Miranda sisters. As a Latina myself, when I see stuff used in comics, I'm always okay. There's a Spanish word here. Let's see how it's used. How do you go about writing with a sense of maybe authenticity is not the good word, but realness to characters who obviously, I mean, you're not a 15-year-old girl or a young female engineer, right? How do you go about that?
Honestly, I do a lot of consulting. I have a lot of people read stuff and give me suggestions, and I think the Miranda sisters came a little more naturally to me. I don't, I'm not Puerto Rican, but there's a good chunk of my family who's Mexican, and so like the feeling of where Spanish belongs in a sentence is a little more something I'm used to than some people that sort of insert bits of Spanish into things, because my grandfather was Mexican, and he was very determined that he didn't speak Spanish, he spoke Mexican. And when people tried to, like when my cousins would take Spanish, that they would try to come speak classroom Spanish to him, he'd tell him to get out of there. He didn't speak that stuff. So I wanted to have it feel sort of more authentic, so I made sure to run stuff by people. I made sure to not try to source things from Google Translate, but from people who knew what they were saying. And if there was something I had to translate, I'd sort of translate it and take it to somebody and be like, hey, is this right? Is this phrased correctly? I think that the character who I think I did that the most with was just trying to get things right for Priya and her family, because she is, her family is Daisy, and I wanted to get that feeling in there, and I wanted to make sure that to people reading this book who have experience with that culture, who are part of that culture, that it sounded right to them and felt like their experience. So I actually reached out to some folks who I listened to special thanks in that first volume to make sure that all of that sounded right, to make sure that it tracked, to catch me when I sort of stereotyped rather than archetyping characters. Because I want these people to feel authentic to their culture and authentic to New York City, because I think it's a weird thing that so many comics take place in New York City, and that if you were to look at comics, especially 80s and before, it seems like New York City is 90% white people. And having been to New York City, I know that's not the case. so I wanted to make sure that everybody sounded right. And I do the same thing with a lot of science. I have now a large number of female scientists that I've, met through interviewing people for, Agents of Girl in the back of every issue. And I consult a lot with Tamara, who's on Mythbusters Junior now and has been on a bunch of science shows, because she has a very sort of wide general knowledge of science and engineering that I can sort of take a lot of general questions and bounce them off her, and either she knows the answer or can talk to somebody who can give me a better, clearer answer. So it's fun being able to make sure that stuff is right. I've had everything from, in issue 4 of this current series, when Nadia pops out of the lab, one of the things that kept coming up in discussions about bipolar disorder is that a lot of times when people are manic, when they are really concentrating hard on this one thing and paying just attention to that when they speak to people, a lot of the times they revert to like first languages. And so I wanted to have, when she pops out, she's speaking Russian and doesn't realize it. Ying tells her in English, and Nadia says, "I am speaking English." And so I wanted to make sure I got the Russian right. So I had to track down my friend who is from college, who is a Russian professor now, and sort of run these things by him and be like, I want this to make sense. So it doesn't have to sound like perfectly street Russian because she's raised in a lab, but I do want it to sound like something a Russian person would say. So it's interesting, like realizing where your gaps in knowledge are and trying to find people who can help you fill those.
Well, I will say this, all of that research definitely paid off. I never once questioned any background of the characters. In fact, I think one of my favorite moments in Agents of Girl is when Nadia is trying to get Priya to secretly be her research partner. And she's like, my parents are immigrants, so there are only two things that they care about: me taking opportunities, and I don't go anywhere without telling them because they're going to think I'm dead somewhere. And like, my family aren't immigrants, but like as somebody who grew up with a lot of, first generation friends, and even just like my mom has kind of retained that mentality from her parents, I was like, oh, that makes sense. I feel like that. There are so many moments in Agents of Girl and in the current series where I'm very just amazed with how well everybody's written, because they each feel like their own person. And just that's really well done. I feel there's going to be a lot of me praising you this episode.
Thanks. It's very important to me because, like, I did talk about, the fact that I want it to seem like actual New York, and I want people to seem like they actually come from places and know things. And I feel like, my ideal would be for, these characters to end up in other books, and for, this to be a sort of diversity that spreads out into other things. So, because I've had several people tell me that, like, they're just not used to seeing South Asian people at all in comics, and having Priya, who's an Indian American woman in there, is unusual enough that they sort of sat up and took notice and started reading the book because they saw somebody that looked like them, which is unusual.
Yeah, I mean, I think you definitely succeed.
I was going to say there are a lot of moments where Nadia reminds me of me today. There's a lot of moments where Nadia reminds me of like me when I was a child. And I always think it's funny because sometimes in today's comic book world, you see people where they're like, these characters don't exist in real life. And I was like, no, that was definitely, 10-year-old Elizabeth being told she was going to space camp. Like, I definitely had that energy if you were talking about science. And especially with the newer issues, like some of my most favorite parts is like being explained what friction is. Like, I know what friction is, but I'm just such a nerd that I get really excited reading the Google definition of friction again, but in like Nadia's voice. So I'm excited for like kids and girls that like me who want to go to space camp who get to read this book. Like, I am so excited for them. And that's a weird feeling to have, but I'm really excited for them.
Yeah, I actually read out the page where she's in Agent's a Girl in volume 1, where she's in the middle of Times Square, and the Nadia science fact is talking about megawatts and kilowatt hours and all that stuff. I read that out to my husband because my husband is actually a scientist. He has a master's in biology, and I read it to him and he was like, wow, that's really good. I was like, yeah. And Tesla, Carl Sagan, and Neil deGrasse Tyson have all been mentioned within this volume. And he was just like, oh, wow. Because we have this talk a lot about representation is one thing, but actually pushing kids in a direction where, or not necessarily kids, but, young people who may not see themselves, pushing them to take that step to, like Lizzie said, ask to go to space camp or go Google more about watts and wattage and stuff like that is something that is really good from a teaching perspective, whether it's extrinsically teaching where they go outside the comic to Google stuff, or intrinsically where they're actually picking up bits of knowledge from it.
I will say, as the girl who spent a lot of her childhood making potato guns and various things like that, this is exactly the kind of comic that I would have wanted when I was a kid, encouraging that experimentation, learning more about science, making cool stuff. So yeah, I really love that about the book. It's really awesome.
Thank you. Yeah, I think a lot of that stuff, especially in the first volume, is influenced by Elsa, who's the artist on the first volume. I think especially the science facts, because it's funny you mentioned the Times Square stuff, because my first drafts of the first few scripts didn't have any of that stuff in there. And as you're reading that first issue, there's the picture of the giant robot that they're fighting, and there's these sort of cutaways that Elsa did of what the inside of the robot looks like. And I was looking at that and I was like, the only way that makes sense is if Nadia is seeing that. Like, if that's Nadia's mind working out how this robot works, which is brilliant. Like, I love that idea. What if, we explain those by, like, having her do these sort of science facts where, she tells us what she's seeing because, we don't know this stuff. Nadia knows this stuff. So, like, I started doing, like, all this research on robots, which, ended up in that first issue. And then I think that's issue 3 where she's in Times Square. And at night, and I was like, I want to have science facts in here too, but I don't have anything yet. Like, what do I do in here? And I was just like looking at that page of her marveling at Times Square and thinking about being in Times Square and just that feeling of like, who said this was okay? Like, why are there this many lights? Why is it this bright? Like, what must the cost of this be? And I was like, surely there's some kind of data on that somewhere. And like, I started looking up, these reports that people had done on it, and sort of mining through all these various resources. And it's funny because I was disappointed because the information that's in there is the best information that they have, because unfortunately Times Square is on the same block as all this like theater district stuff. So like, you can't know exactly how much electricity Times Square takes up because it all goes to the same place, all of this stuff at the theater district. And I was like, man, I want to know about just Times Square. All right. But yeah, I get kind of where I'm nerding out about stuff like that. And the bit with the friction and drifting and everything was one that I wrote kind of my description in that first issue. I was like, I know roughly how this works. And then I handed it off to Tamara and I was like, hey, can you make this not terrible? And she kind of came back and gave me a better description to work with. And, adjusted some things to make sure, it's in voice and everything. But yeah, we get to play with, real science on that one. So it was nice.
It was like Wasp Fast and Furious. Like, it was perfect.
I want that. I want a live action Nadia Pym Fast and the Furious movie.
Yeah, I always think about like all these stories I'd like to do with Nadia, like all the characters I want her to meet in the Marvel universe, and the various types of stories they can have. I feel like having Nadia and her team using science to be illegal race car drivers would be a great miniseries.
So Pie in the Sky, what other adventure would you want to take her on? Who would you want her to meet? Like the biggest idea you could think of.
Well, at some point, I would like her to meet her father, but it's a completely different thing. But I would really like to do a story with her, just her and Valeria trying to fix some problem, trying to save the world. Just the two of them and their wits and whatever's around them, trying to MacGyver their way out of something.
Actually, sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah.
So one of the things I also have a question about is how was it, writing a new Wasp essentially? Were you worried at all? Because Janet Van Dyne is iconic in a lot of ways. How was that process for you?
I think my biggest concern going in was that I didn't want people to feel like we were just sort of tossing Janet aside, because Janet has never had her own ongoing series. She's had a couple, one-offs, minis, kind of things here and there. She's obviously been in the Avengers plenty. She's shown up in lots of other books, but she's never had her own sort of, Winsome Wasp ongoing series. I didn't want people who were fans of Janet to feel like she was getting left behind or stepped over, because I love Janet. She's a fantastic character, and she has so many interesting traits that are uncommon in the Marvel universe, like being a grown-ass adult, which is like of the core Avengers, she's the one that's got it figured out. And that's interesting to me. She's got like a real life and a career and stuff, whereas half of them don't know what to do when they're not trying to save the world. So like,
this is the best description of Janet Van Dyne ever.
Yeah, it's incredibly accurate.
Yeah, and that was my concern going in, and I wanted to, like, in that first volume, have Janet like in there right away. And I think, to my editorial team's credit, they were like, this isn't Janet's book, and if the first thing you do is introduce Janet, it's going to become Janet's book. And that's not it's not the book we hired you to write. So I had sort of the adventures of Nadia and Jarvis going there for the first few issues, before when things go really wrong, the big guns get called in, and Janet comes in for 7 and 8. But like, yeah, that was the biggest thing for me, is like I had no doubt after the first couple conversations I had with Mark Waid about Nadia, that like there was stories to tell there, and that we could do something cool and interesting with her and with the book. But yeah, I was worried, and I still am to a lesser extent, that people will think that she is a replacement for Janet, when I think Janet is irreplaceable. And I think, unlike a lot of characters who are legacy characters, they don't have a lot in common character wise. Nadia is much more like Hank in the things that she cares about. She's much more like a lot of other characters out there than she is like Janet. I think that's part of why Janet makes for a good mentor for her. Is Janet has kind of seen it all, but is still sort of wowed by Nadia and what Nadia can do, and Nadia's optimism I think makes Janet more optimistic herself.
That's awesome. And I know, I'm sure Ash has a lot to say, because one of the reasons Ash is guesting on here is because we actually had Ash guest star on our The Wasp Matters episode, because the Wasp is her favorite character.
Yeah, Janet is my since I've been about 8 years old, Janet's been my favorite Marvel character. And I will say that you do such a good job with Janet in this, and it doesn't for a second feel like Nadia is a replacement or a lesser version than Janet, and partially because the reason you mentioned, they're so different, and I think they work really well together, and Nadia's presence in Janet's life has been really interesting to see, and I love what it's doing for her character growth.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, that was the big thing. I think I had so much fun writing, especially like the first half of that issue 7 in the first series, where it's all sort of done from Janet's point of view, because we get sort of this picture of the wonderful day-to-day life of Janet Van Dyne, of being an adult and doing things and kind of still enjoying being a superhero, where a lot of superheroes don't. And that she just schedules a time to go beat up guys with Black Widow because she just needs to get her cardio in for the day. And of course, Black Widow's always got spare guys to beat up.
Yeah, it's just seeing her after this. Honestly, I think is one of the best representations we've seen of Janet in a very, very long time. Yeah, she's just really, and also seeing her in a leather jacket was also very cool. I just want to throw that in there. It's like everything I didn't know I needed. Her clothes are always. She's a fashion designer. Her clothes have got to be the best.
I know, but like that certainly don't disappoint. That leather jacket though is so good. And she would also be like a really good, like, easy cosplay to do too. Like,
casual Janet Van Dyne.
Yeah.
Have like suggestions about costumes for or outfits for her and Nadia, and I usually like try to tone back my voice on that a little bit, and I'm like, this is kind of what I'm thinking. Person who actually does art, draw something better than that. And yeah, I think the whole thing of them like ending up covered in goo because they're fighting that giant blob thing, and then having to like stop at a local boutique that happens to be a very like hot topic-y kind of boutique was a fun thing for me, because I think that's that hard look is something we don't often see from either of them. So giving them an excuse to wear leather and studs was a fun thing to get to do.
I also think it's just really fun I know at least for me, because in the past, and I've said this a lot about Mary Jane Watson, bless her heart, but like for a woman who is supposed to be a fashion model, and for someone who has binged a lot of America's Next Top Model, I can say this with full confidence that Tyra Banks would be really upset with a lot of the things that woman has worn in many a comic panel. So it's really refreshing to see like women in cute clothes in comics, and in clothes that like women would fashionably wear and fashion designers would feasibly wear.
Yeah. I know there are, I don't want to say there aren't, because there are guys out there that can draw fashion. I mean, there's, Chris Anka out there doing his damnedest to like draw people in fashion. But I think like it's a real benefit to this series that, we have had all female artists to this point who know something about women's fashion and know how to draw clothes. And it really shows in ways that are both like, with big things like, the app that you mentioned, but just from like a day-to-day thing that, every character has a different fashion sense, that Priya's clothes look different than Shay's clothes look different than Nadia's clothes. And like, even if you just saw them in silhouette, it's easy to tell who's who, in a way that like a lot of male artists understand when it comes to superhero costumes, but have more trouble with on like clothing. And like that's an incredible thing for that. I feel like you could do a whole group cosplay of Nadia throughout these first two volumes with different outfits. She's it's important to me that she changes clothes.
I mean, and that's also a good thing, right? Because that makes her feel real. I mean,
Yeah.
I've definitely have had points in comics or even cartoons where I'm like, why are they still wearing the same clothes? Or why are they wearing clothes that just don't work or look weird? Like that's definitely one of the strengths. And like you said, each character that surrounds her also has their own sense of style. Nothing seems derivative when it comes to them, whether it's how they speak or how they dress. Is it a hard process to kind of narrow down, to switch between characters, I guess, voices, and maintain differences between them, whether it's in, drawing style or just switching between their actual dialogue?
Every once in a while, I read a line for a character that I'm like, that's not the right character for that line. But I think for the most part, they end up being so distinct in a lot of ways that it is fairly easy to figure out, what the conversation sounds like. I really love writing for Taina, because
I love Taina. I love her so much.
Yeah, I think, it was sort of an early decision with her that like I wanted her to have CP and to be physically disabled, but I definitely didn't want her to be the character that like then constantly had everybody feeling bad for her and was feeling left behind or getting kidnapped all the time. So like from the get-go, Taina's evil. Like she's just mean to people, and she has such a like cutting voice, and her sister Alexis is got easily a foot and a half on her, and is she's attractive and athletic and everything else, but like Taina does not care. She will give her shit about everything. She will cut her down to size no matter what. Like there's that bit in 5 when they're leaving where like Taina's like, yeah, I've got to get my sister out of here before she gets beat up again. It's like she can't stop, like because she Alexis gets beat up twice in 2 issues, despite being the like physically largest of the group. And Alexis is like, hey,
I love Taina because like the way you're describing her and the way that she comes across, like I knew those girls growing up, and I like always wanted to be them, but like I always cared a little bit too much what everybody else thought. But like she feels like a lot of my Chicana friends, growing up, like she feels very real and realized and like strong and powerful, and just in words. Like there aren't a lot of people who can cut you down to size with one sentence, but Taina is definitely one of them.
Yeah, I had a friend like that in college. My friend Suzanne, the tiny Jewish girl, all of about 5 feet tall and skinny, and every once in a while, we'd be hanging around together, and some guy would either try to flirt with her or, decide to be rude to her, and she would just rip them to shreds, like just say something and walk away like she didn't bacteria that she just eviscerated the sky. And like, it's so incredible to watch. Like, these guys that think they've got everything figured out, and just sort of like this tiny girl just says something to them, and they're done. They can ring the bell. They've got nothing left. They don't know how to come back from it. It never occurred to them that this person would just destroy them.
Yeah, I will say a lot of the dynamics between the people in the group ring really true with, like, if they feel like a group of friends, which I sometimes in media, if people try a little bit too hard, I think maybe is what it might be. But the group really feels like, yeah, they know each other, they like each other, they work together, and they just work really well together, and it all is very authentic and real.
Thanks. Yeah, I want everybody to have their own voice and also sort of intentionally be distinct, and they've all sort of got their own priorities. And I think it was important to me, especially in this last issue, when with Nadia going through what she's going through, that everybody doesn't either automatically say, well, I have to do whatever it takes to help my friend, despite the fact that she just punched me in the face, or at the same time go, well, clearly she's having issues, I'm out. The decision that everybody makes is really, I think, backed up by who that character has been up to that point. And it was important to me. I feel like it was just as important to me, what happens to Nadia, as like that Priya feels like she has to stay, that she feels like she has to, go in. She has this, feeling of fate and heroism about her, the same way that, you so often see associated with actual, superheroes in these types of stories.
And that was something that was really good to see too, just, on the page, because I do know that there are some people who are equipped to handle, to have that empathetic outreach to people who are struggling. And then there are some people who, sometimes just have to understand their own position and maybe not put themselves in a position to get hurt, or understand that they're not the one that can help at that moment. So seeing all of the women react, the young women react differently was really great, because all of them are like, everybody made that choice and they were all valid in making those choices. And as much as I was so happy that Priya stayed, I also didn't fault the others for leaving. And so being able to build that understanding is something that's really, really good and hard to pull off. Yeah, does anybody else? Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, I feel like, it was, I think just as sure as Priya is staying, as Taina is going, she is pissed at Nadia at that point, for reasons that I think other people in the group don't even really get at that point. Taina is looking at this board and seeing herself labeled as broken, and finding out that Nadia has, called her doctor without any sort of permission, because Nadia is on this sort of manic trip of trying to fix things. And so, like, Taina sees this and is immediately like, no, I don't care. You go do whatever. Is like, I think is true to that character is anything else.
Lizzie, Ash, do y'all have any questions?
I don't really have a question, but I do think it is really nice to see a character who is in a wheelchair who's not like sad about their life because they're in a wheelchair. Like, that's really refreshing.
Thank you. Yeah, I didn't want to write that character or that story, so that's not my experience of people who are disabled or people in wheelchairs. So that wasn't the character I wanted to write in there. Like, in some ways she's maybe one of the more active characters of the group as far as, participating and stuff and acting out and kind of wearing her heart on her sleeve.
She definitely is, and I love her a lot for that, and I love that she like argues so much with her sister and is like, "Go get my chair." Like, because I feel like that was me. Like when I was an auxiliary wheelchair user, like that was 100% me when I was using my chair. So I felt very seen.
I love the way that Rosie ended up drawing that sequence at the beginning of I guess not quite the beginning of issue 8 of the first volume, where like she's sending Alexis to go get her chair while simultaneously like rushing up the steps on her crutches to go like see everybody. She has no problem assigning tasks and also sort of pushing herself out there where she's going to do whatever, but she also fully like knows her limitations. She just doesn't care.
I just wanted to say, as somebody who, like I mentioned earlier, I'm a huge fan of the Wasp, and I have been for most of my life. I just wanted to say that you've done a fantastic job. I'm not sure if carrying on the legacy is the right term, because Jan hasn't necessarily gone anywhere, but just seeing this character presented in this way has been really amazing to see. Because for a lot of my life, I was like, why don't people realize how cool the Wasp is? And now they do, and I think that's amazing, and you've just done a really great job with it.
Thanks. And I feel like I've always felt like Janet was cool. I feel like there have been a couple of animated representations that have tried to do stuff with her to varying degrees of success or being in character of the same Wasp. But like, yeah, I'd like to see Janet be in more stuff and be more central to more stuff in the Marvel Universe. I think she's a great character.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jeremy, for coming on and talking with us about everything Wasp. Why don't you tell everybody when the next issue comes out and where they can find you?
All right. So our March schedule is a little weird because we don't have anything coming out in March. But the next issue is out. I don't have the exact date in front of me, but early in April, as well as the trade collection of the first 5 issues from this new series. And Marvel is also doing a reissue of a full collected edition of all 8 issues of the original series in a digest-sized format.
Oh wow!
So it'll be the whole first 8 issues in there, and that'll be available in comic book stores as well as bookstores and stuff like that. So it'll be easier to track down that whole first volume. That issue is coming out then. But then to make up for our weird schedule with March, we actually are double shipping in May. Both issues 7 and 8 are coming out in May.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's really fun because Alti Fermancia is coming on for issues 7 and 8. We're doing a couple of one-off stories. The first one deals a lot with the other Agents of Girl, sort of in the aftermath of the story in the first 5. So everybody sort of gets a little bit of their own time. We get to hear from everybody, and then Shay is taking Ying to introduce her to her mother. So that's going to be part of that story. And then in issue 7, they just released the solicitation for that. But there's we're having a birthday party for Nadia, who's never had a birthday party.
That is awesome.
Yeah, and it's her desire is to meet a bunch of her family, people she is related to directly or indirectly. So it's finally gonna get to meet some of the stranger branches of the Pym family tree. And also, if you see the cover, one James Buchanan Barnes is making an appearance at the as well. So the cover is great. It has it's a big red image of Nadia getting ready to attack Bucky in his full Winter Soldier gear, and she is getting ready to hit him with a birthday cake. So
we will link to all of that in the show notes. So where can people find you on the internets?
I am on Twitter at jrome58, so it's JROME58. And then I am also on my website, which is just jeremywhitley.com. And I'm still on Tumblr, which is mainly for one of my other comics, Princeless. It's just princelesscomic.tumblr.com. And yeah, I mean, all of those places I'm pretty easy to find and get a hold of. So if anybody wants to talk about Wasp or anything else, I'm more than happy to.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jeremy, for coming on.
My pleasure.
And as always, you can find the podcast at But Why Though PC on all social media. Get involved. Go pick up issues of the Wasp, the Unstoppable Wasp. Read them. Talk with us. Talk with Jeremy via Twitter. And you can find me at Oma Mithrandir on Twitter. Lizzie?
You can find me online at Lizzie Lynn Garcia. You can also find any writing and editing I might have done at butwhythoughpodcast.com or butwhythoughpodcast.com. I always get it wrong, but Kate corrects me. She edits my stuff. That's what she's there for. I also am occasionally talking about TV pilots for Pilots and Petards, which is part of the But Why Though podcast community. We are also on Twitter. That is at Petards Pilots on Twitter, so you can find us there.
Awesome. Ash?
You can find me on Twitter at AirSatsAsh, and pretty much everything else I do on the internet at butwhythoughpodcast.com. I have the Skyhoppers podcast, which is a Star Wars discussion show, and the Safari Zone, which is all about Pokemon. And I have some writing over there as well.
Some.
A lot, maybe.
Ash wrote an entire article about everything you want to know about the Wasp, including TV shows and comic runs that you want to read. So if you listen to this, read The Unstoppable Wasp, and then decide, I want to read more about Janet, go read her article and then read all of that because it's great. Also, I edited it.
Awesome.
I gotta go read that.
And we also have a Wasp. Actually, I should probably plug our podcast episode that we did. We have a podcast episode. 68 of the podcast was all about why the Wasp matters, specifically Janet Van Dyne. But we're going to have to do a Nadia Pym one soon. So,
and I'm on that as well. So if you just can't get enough of my lovely voice, you can go listen to that.
Awesome.